In this video, we're going to be looking at the EL implicit objects that we can use on our pages. So we're just going to do a bunch of operations just to see how we can interact with some of these different objects. What we'll want to do is pull the EL Implicit Objects.mp4 file and go ahead and load that into our system. And that will give us all the code we're looking at today. So to just get started, we have a couple things set up before we get going. We have an application startup servlet, which is simply going to give us the ability to populate a couple of attributes into the application that we can access, called user ID and password, app user and app user password. And we have a request scope servlet, which is going to be hit when we want to pass some objects through the request scope. And so we'll have those set up as request attributes as well. Here there'll be request user and request user password, and we'll dispatch on forward. We're not doing any direct database connections or anything like that at this point. We're basically going to just be doing some simple operations moving around pages just so we can get used to using the EL. And then once we start getting used to it more, we can start building better, more robust applications. Since we have the application parameters in place though, and we want to list them and see them, we do have that listener on the application startup, which is going to give us the context listener to allow those two application variables to be implemented into the application scope. And then we have our regular old database context parameters so we can see how we could get init parameters, our error handler page, and our default listing page. So when we hit the index page, a lot of the things are going to show up right away on the index. This is going to give us a great chance to look at a few of the things we can do without having to do really that much work and start seeing the power of using the expression language in our code. So right away we can pull init parameters. You can see that again, EL is simply formulated with that $sign and then the brackets. And the implicit object to get the init parameters is of course init param. And then we're going to pull the specific user DB user ID. So again, if we went back and looked at our web XML, you can see that's the parameter name. So it's nothing spectacular. It's simply pulling that init param scope and the DB user ID variable right out of that parameter. There are other things you can do. You can get header information, such as what browser the user is on. And we can also find out our context path. So this is going to give us the context path of the actual application, which will allow us to then have a variable if we wanted to switch out context paths, if we were to deploy from one server to another, and the path might be a little different based on the server. I've listed the entire header value collection, but what you'll see is that when we only list an array, it's just going to list out hash codes, which is fine. We're not going to do anything with it. But we could iterate that once we know how to do that, and then we could list each header value individually. And right away, I'm going to pull the application variables. So another implicit object that we have is going to be the application scope. So the application scope, of course, will pull those application variables that we listed on our listener servlet. Let's go ahead and populate into the session a session user ID and password, and we'll call that ses user and 12 ses user. And then we have some cookies in place, credentials UID cookie user and credentials password cookie user password. So those will be cookies, and we'll also be able to see how we can get to those through the expression language. So our nav bars is going to be pages. Our error handler has that same expression language that we may have seen before when we were working through and we turned off our scripting. This is just the page context object, which is another implicit object that we can use. And here we're going to grab the exception off the page context and the message from that page context exception, if it ever happens, if we had an error. We aren't going to force one in this system, but you could set up a page to force one if you wanted to practice that. We also have two pages for request parameters, a page for request scope, and a page for session scope. Request scope will be another implicit object that we can use to display variables that have been passed in through the request scope. So once again, that's our request user ID and request password. The session is the same thing. And you can see that I've wrapped these in a JSP text formatted tag just for whatever reason, so that you could see that that could easily be used. That's again one of those implicit standard actions that we didn't really look at too much because you can see that it's not really doing too much. And then finally we have request parameters, which is going to be a page where we're just going to use another forward tag, set up a couple of request parameters. We're going to pass on to request parameters 2. And there we're going to pull all of the param values. And here another implicit object called param. So not to be confused with the request scope, this is the param object which gets the query string request parameters. So it's just a little bit different. But once again, another object that we need to be aware of. Finally, the cookies page. And on the cookies page, we'll see the power of EL, because now we can grab cookies in a couple of different ways here. I'm just showing a couple of different syntaxes to do this. But essentially, we don't have to do all the looping and pulling to find a matching name. What we can do is directly access a cookie, and that value will come back. Of course, if it's null, we'd have a problem, but we know that we're going to have these set up based on our index having set up those cookies for us. But I wanted to show this in two different ways because it is essentially an array, and we can hit that cookie array value for the name, or we can just directly .syntax the entire thing. So either way works just as well. All right, let's go ahead and run our system and see some of this all in action. So again, we'll start off with the index, which is going to have init parameters, page context stuff, headers, some session stuff will be set, and then we'll have our nav bar at the bottom that we can move around. So here you can see we pulled our init parameter. We can see the browser that we're using here is Mozilla 5.0. And here is our context path, EL implicit objects. So that's great. We could actually use that to change our context path if we needed to redirect somewhere and we didn't have that path set correctly. The too much information section, again, is our cookie array here. We have some cache information, a connection information, host information, some language information, user agent. You can see the power. You can grab this user agent and put that in that array value printout just like we did here. So any of these values, if you wanted to see what they were, you could do something similar to what we had in the index there. Basically, we were using the user agent. We could change that out with any of those that we've seen. We have our application variables pulled in through our application implicit object, the application scope. So if we look at request parameters, this drives us through the servlet and then puts them into the request and comes back with the request parameter user ID and request parameter password. Again, the request scope is just going to pull those directly out of the scope. The session scope is our session user, and then the power of our cookie. We can see our cookie user is also accessed. And again, we just clicked through those really quickly, but you can go back and look at the code and see exactly how that's being pulled and essentially know that our EL language is going to be very powerful for us going forward in our web systems.